Okay, we are recording, David.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. Thank you to Forrest Howe and to Bronwyn Larson and to Monty Butler for keeping things going behind the scenes. And thank you to Barry Casey for being here this morning for us and this afternoon for him.
Yeah.
Luke 12 and John 13. I've got that the other way around. It's John 12 and Luke 13. Oh, actually, it's John 11. Here we go. Martha went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" The Jews said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" At that very time, there were some present who told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. He asked them, "Do you think that because these Galileans suffered in this way, that they were worse sinners than all other Galileans? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all perish as they did." Or those 18 who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others living in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will all perish just as they did. So we begin with prayer. Dear God, thank you for another Sabbath. Thank you for these ancient texts that bring such new insights to us. We see Jesus relating to the problem of suffering and evil in two very different ways in these texts. One quite engaged with the people, others more of a seemingly academic approach. And these two approaches have been sort of tugging at each other for a while, more theoretical and more experiential. Today, Barry Casey is going to help us bring them together. We thank you for him, for all the years he served us well, and for his friendship. And we look forward to hearing from him today. In Christ's name, amen. Well, Barry, welcome back.
Yes, thank you.
Good to see you. Do you remember Monty Clifford?
Yes, I do.
Okay, just this little inside talk before we get going. You and Monty remind me a lot because you have both established a kind of serenity that that I find enviable. I don't know how you two did it. Quite different theologically, obviously, but just kind of content with life and not thrashing about trying to make it something different than it is. So I admire you both on that. Since we last saw you, you've been traveling.
A little bit, yeah.
Up to Alberta?
Yes, to Banff.
How'd it go?
Oh, it was so wonderful. We have family up there that they actually live in Banff, if you can imagine.
Wow.
And there's a little town just down the road called Canmore. and we stayed in a condo there that was lent to us, and did things in Canmore and then went up to Banff. So we were there for 10 days. It was just wonderful.
Wow. Now your family is from Canada. Do I remember that correctly?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, I still have family in British Columbia,
Mhm.
but I'm not all that close to them. They're rather removed in the family line. But yeah, I lived with my grandparents in Oshawa. It was Oshawa Missionary College in those days.
Yeah.
And but my wife is Filipino, and she is an American citizen, but the rest of her family are Canadian citizens.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah, so her brother lives in Banff, and her parents live in Red Deer, not too far from CUC, or Berman
Okay.
now it is. Yeah.
Now these must have been the other grandparents than the ones you lived in Angwin with.
No, they're the same ones. We came
Really?
down.
So they
Yeah, we
lived
came
there
down.
and they moved to Angwin and you came with them.
That's right. Yeah.
As how old were you?
I think when we left Canada, I was going into the second grade.
Okay.
So I think it was
Yeah.
about 6 or 7, something like that.
So you, like me, went to prep and PUC and on from there. Now
Yeah.
from PUC, you went directly to Claremont, did you?
No, I went to Canada and worked in British Columbia for a year, volunteering at a school there in Kelowna. Then back down to Riverside for the summer and worked in a church there. And then we went to Andrews, and we were there for a couple of years.
Were you really?
Yeah,
I
I
didn't
was
realize
at
that.
the graduate school, got a degree in religion and journalism. I was one of the first graduates from that program. And my wife at the time, Bonnie, she was in the English department getting an MA.
Okay. All right.
So then we went from there to Claremont, and she taught at La Sierra, and I went to Claremont.
So you went straight away from the seminary, no, from the graduate school at Andrews, straight into the Claremont program.
Yes.
So when I looked at your dissertation, I could see names that were familiar to me. Dan Rhodes,
Right. That's
John
right.
Hutchison, and Jack Verheiden were all on your committee.
Yes.
What an excellent committee you had.
Oh, yeah. And then Jim Walters was my visiting examiner too.
I noticed that. I was going to make a little more celebration of it than that. I was going to say, yes, our own James Walters was your external examiner.
Yes.
Was he hard on you?
No, he was probably a little too generous.
I got a note from him last night saying, I see you're going to talk with Barry. That's great. Have a good time. Congratulations. So
Oh, yeah.
that's from Jim. All right. So here you are at Claremont studying in the Philosophy of Religion and Theology program, PRT, or were you in theological ethics?
I started at the School of Theology,
Mm-hmm.
and I got an MA there and then continued on to the PhD program without a break at Claremont.
Okay.
At the graduate school. And yeah, it's called graduate school then. And so I started out in philosophy of religion and 20th century theology. That's actually the title of the degree.
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized many years later when I was reading Isaiah Berlin is that what I really wanted was to do intellectual history, like Isaiah Berlin. So I got as close as I could with 20th century theology, a kind of history of ideas there. But yeah, I did philosophy of religion. And when I was at Newbold, one of the American teachers, Bob Zamora, who was teaching at Columbia Union College, went over there, and he was one of my professors at Newbold. And he said, at the end of that school year, because I told him I was planning to go to grad school, he said, when you get done, give me a call. And so I did. When I was done with my graduate exams, I gave him a call and he said, you should have been here yesterday. So I flew out and got the job. And
Wow. Wow.
so I saw him in the airport here in Washington. I thought he was picking me up, but he was on an airplane heading to Mountain View to interview for a job out there. So I didn't actually work with him in the religion department, but yeah, that's how that went.
Well, so you crossed paths going the opposite direction.
Yes, that's right.
Now, when did you start getting into the issue of theodicy? When did that become kind of a compelling enough interest for you to do your dissertation on it?
Yeah. When I left Claremont, I had in mind to do a dissertation on Jürgen Moltmann's ethics, because I had read Theology of Hope and was quite influenced by him when I was at Claremont. And so I did my comprehensives, and then I went back to CUC to start teaching, and I just got overwhelmed with teaching. I was teaching like 5 classes and stuff like that. And as time went on, I thought, well, I don't really know German well enough to immerse myself in all of that. And as I was studying, I couldn't discern what Moltmann's ethics really were, and not in depth. So I kind of had to put it aside. And I didn't have any idea where I'd go from there, And the years went on and I was teaching and enjoying it, but just, up to my neck in classes. And then things took a turn. I was getting kind of depressed and my marriage was on the rocks and I couldn't make any kind of breakthrough with a dissertation. And I had written this little essay called The Tao of Adventism.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mostly an exercise for myself to say, okay, you're an Adventist. What's most important to you about Adventism? And it was the Sabbath and the second coming. All the other stuff is pretty much cultural.
Okay.
And not to set aside, Jesus Christ and Trinity and all of that, but those were the important things that I thought distinguished Adventism from other Protestant denominations. And I thought, why do you stay Adventist? And what is it about it that could really ground your life? And it came down to those two things. And then as I got thinking more about it, it seemed to me that Sabbath was so much richer than just the fourth commandment and something we have to keep. It was really one half of a whole philosophy of life. And the other half for me was the second coming. And they seemed to me to really complement each other very well. And I thought, what is the hope? Well, in Adventism, it's usually about the second coming. But I flipped it around and said, here's creation, here's Sabbath. Where's the hope in that? So I just began to think and study, and that's kind of how it began. So it was kind of a self-preservation thing. I was, I didn't have time to write, and I didn't have any hope. And so I started to work on it and, kind of search my own thoughts and ethics. And so it grew out of that. And it's kind of become.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, it's just become, one of two central pillars in my life.
But that accounts somewhat, I think, for the experiential tone of your dissertation. If it came right out of your own existence,
Yes.
or your own experience, that gives it a particular edge, I think. Now, did you have any difficulty convincing your committee that this was a good idea?
I think there was a little surprise on their part and just a little bit of hesitation. I should also point out that they were in California and I was in Maryland.
Right.
And we weren't in touch that much,
Right.
all those years. I'd pay my continuing fee every year and, try to assure them that I was going to finish this thing. Meanwhile, knowing that what I'd started out with, I couldn't do. But I sent in the proposal and they seemed to think it was okay. I don't think they were excited about it. But, as I worked on it, it became quite important to me. I remember John Hutchison saying to us, look, just do your dissertation. You're not going to change history. You're not going to contribute anything to the theological world. It's a hoop that you have to go through. So don't stress about it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I had that in the back of my mind. But nevertheless, it took on this very personal, spiritual and theological kind of overlay for me. And it became quite personal. I wanted to figure this out for myself.
Wow. It's a work of art. Most dissertations are not works of art, but this one is. So it comes out of your own experience and your own aesthetic.
Yeah.
Ways of looking and writing. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what theodicy is as such, unless you have prepared something you would like to share.
Yes, I can. I'll read a few paragraphs here just so I can get it. So you'll have it in a more condensed form.
Okay.
And theodicy is quite literally the justification of God in the face of evil. So as it's usually presented as a theological problem, and I put that word problem in quotes because I have a different viewpoint of that. It's the assumption that God is both perfectly good and supremely powerful. A good God would want to prevent evil from ravaging his creation, and all-powerful God would be able to do so. But if God is both willing and able, and yet evil exists, where does it come from? And why doesn't God eliminate it? So that's kind of the framework. And there have been two main approaches to that question of theodicy. And the first is Augustine, 354 to 430. And that's an interesting, I give you the date because the second form by Irenaeus actually precedes Augustine. Irenaeus's dates are 130 to 302, but it's Augustine's view that won out in the church. And it's sometimes called the free will defense. Now, Augustine said that God is both omnipotent and perfectly good, and he thought that moral evil exists as a privation of being. In other words, it's kind of, it's the absence of good. Nevertheless, evil is very real, but it's the absence of good. And he thought that, and this is in contrast to the Platonic and the Manichaean and Gnostic philosophies, he thought that creation was essentially good. The cosmos, I'm quoting, is a variegated good, harmonious in all its parts. But although nature is good, it's mutable and therefore corruptible. It can be diminished, augmented, changed, and destroyed. So Augustine believed that evil had no real power of its own, although it is very real, but draws on the good like a parasite. On the plane of moral evil, this privation is attributable to the degenerate will of humans who freely turn away from the grace and goodness of God. So that's the free will defense. We have will, we've got we've got freedom by God, and yet we freely turn away from that. He made a place for what we might call natural evil, that is tornadoes and famines and tsunamis, through his aesthetic theme, which attempts to view the universe from the vantage point of God. And at that point, my head snapped back. I thought, that's easy for you to say, the vantage point of God, but that's not our vantage point. We don't see the world as God does. So I thought that he did a bit of a sidestep there. His view was that if we could back away far enough, the world and all of its history would look like a tapestry woven with black and white threads, and we'd see the big pattern. We wouldn't be distinguishing the individual black threads and white threads. And I didn't resonate too well with that.
Really? You didn't like that?
No, I thought, we're fallible, we're mortal, we're here on this earth. It's really hard to see the big picture from God's point of view, and to somehow smooth out all of those terrible things that happen and just say, believe me, God sees it all and it's all going to be okay.
Yes, I think that's a very, very apt description of what he had in mind. Now he doesn't say we can, right?
No,
if
he
we could
didn't.
stand back far enough, I think he would think of, if he could, he would think of the astronauts today way up and seeing the Earth from a distance. And
Yeah.
from that distance, it's just gorgeous, right? You don't see all the inner conflict, and that's how it must look for God. Sad for us, we can't see it that way, but we know that God can, and that's some comfort to us. So all we see is just a little portion of it where we're caught up in our darkness. But from that distance, even the worst parts of the globe look beautiful.
Yes.
They all come together in a coherent way. But you don't find that so helpful.
Well, I thought, okay, I can understand that. I'm a Christian, I'm studying theology and philosophy. I'm sort of in the club, and this language I can understand. But what about someone who grew up in Southeast LA, or the South Side of Chicago or Pakistan? How is it going to sound to them? They're looking at it from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
And, so that's kind of where I stepped off the Augustinian boat, not entirely, but, I wanted to have something that was on the ground from the human point of view, and something that could, I hoped, make sense to people who were not steeped in scripture, in theology, and Christianity for that matter, something that would speak to them on a human level. So then the other major position is that of Irenaeus, and he looked at it as kind of our moral immaturity. He didn't develop a systematic theodicy, but he put forward several points. And in our time, John Hick is the one who's most responsible for developing kind of the components of an Irenaean theodicy. It posits a gradual human growth from moral and spiritual immaturity to a more highly developed state. It believes in human freedom to worship or reject God, These two elements, potential for growth and development and human moral freedom, form the backdrop against which the major differences appear in contrast to the Augustinian free will defense. So, Augustine thought that sin was us willfully disobedient, and Irenaeus thought it as us being immature. We don't really get it. Instead of Augustine's tragic and incomprehensible fall from grace into sin, the Irenaean theodicy suggests that man was created as an imperfect, immature creature who is to undergo moral development and growth, and finally be brought to the perfection intended for him by his maker. That's John Hick.
Was he at Claremont when you were there?
Yes, he was. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I didn't have any classes from him, but I heard him. Excuse me. Instead of the world divided between the wholly good and wholly evil, Irenaeus's worldview is a blend of good and bad, making possible an environment which encourages human moral growth. And how does Irenaean theodicy account for hurricanes and accidents and fires? It's one that allows for the presence of moral and natural evil without an inherent contradiction in the concept of a good and powerful God. So there's no contradiction as far as Irenaeus and John Hick believe.
So you just say there's none.
Yeah, there's right.
Okay, that kind of solves the problem in a hurry, right?
Yeah.
There's no issue here.
Right. So, I mean, I guess it would be like, well, stuff happens,
Yeah.
But
So,
you don't try to justify it.
So as I understand it, Augustine's saying, stand back, look at the whole picture.
Yeah.
As far back as you can. And your point is we don't get to stand back. And some of us really can't stand back because our circumstances are so unfortunate.
Yeah.
Then Hick is saying, well, look ahead, right? This is your development. You're going to school here, and someday the human race is going to graduate and we'll all be so much better off. And so you have these two, but now you've told us why you don't go for an Augustinian point of view. That is, you don't think we can get God's viewpoint. And so that's not so helpful.
Yeah.
But what about his private, I'm sticking with Augustine just a little longer. Yeah. What about his notion that evil is a privation? And the reason I ask it is that Sigmund Tonsted, amongst others, has made the point that the idea that evil is the absence of good doesn't do justice to the kinds of horrors we see humans commit. Yes. And that evil must be more than emptiness. Evil must now we know why Augustine did what he did. He didn't want to give evil any reality because he didn't want to slip back into the Manichaeanism that he used to be in, right? Yeah, which made evil fundamental. So we can understand why he talked that way, but so he wanted to say evil is emptiness, nothing. But Siva and others, but I think Siva particularly would say, look at the Holocaust.
Exactly.
That wasn't just emptiness. There was a vigorous, powerful, we would say demonic activity there. And so what? Yeah. I'm trying to probe this idea that evil is emptiness, evil is the privation of good, and so forth and so on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's just not strong enough. To say the absence of good is to, like you say, to somehow set the Holocaust aside when you have something that is actively, determinately, almost religiously and relentlessly evil. This is not an accident. There's plenty of forethought and planning and organization there. And so I don't find that persuasive, that privation of evil. But I suppose I could put it on a spectrum where at one end you might have that privation of the good, but at the other end you've got this definitive intentional evil. And we might find ourselves along that spectrum various places in our lifetime as what we do and also what we experience in the world.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I don't think we've got to choose between those. For me, I'm seeing the world as much closer to the intentional evil than Augustine apparently did.
So you're not altogether persuaded by his privation idea of evil, and you're not altogether persuaded by taking God's point of view on these matters. Okay,
No.
now back to Irenaeus.
Yeah.
And you've explained to us why you have reservations about Augustine's point of view. What are your reservations, if any, about Irenaeus's point of view?
Well, I don't see us as developing morally in quite the speed and authenticity that Hick does. And Irenaeus called it our veil of not veil of suffering, but sort of veil of teaching or learning. And I can see that. Hopefully we do learn from the tragic experiences we go through, but what I don't want is that we think that these are necessary experiences. In other words, God says, you're not paying attention, so I'm going to kill your wife, or you just don't get it, so I'm going to rub your nose in. I'm being crude here, but this is how some people experience God. Or they'll come up to you when you're grieving and say, God has a plan. Everything somehow works together, and this must mean that God took her because, she was ready to go or something like that. These are not comforting words. And I don't think that God sends evil on us. I just don't think that. I mean, if that's the case, then who needs a devil, right? But I think that God, for several reasons, allows evil to happen. And that's why we have these questions of theodicy. Why does he allow it? And so I don't see the Irenaean theodicy as very persuasive, although, it's very hopeful. Things are going to get better. You are going to mature. You'll understand, toward the end of your life, you might be a lot more capable of understanding than when you're a teenager, which I think is probably true. But again, it's not a philosophy that you could sort of package up and plunk down in front of someone and say, here you go, this is the answer. So I respect the work that those people have done and the countless articles and books that have been written since defending those views. Who am I to stand up here and try to refute these two, But for me, I think I wanted to have something grounded, rather modest. I'm not changing history here by any means, or even a part of it, but something I could carry in my pocket that would work for me from day to day. And I am influenced by both of those, but I'm not seeing those as my guiding lights, if you like.
Okay, so here we have Augustine's view of the matter, privation of good and God's point of view. And then we have Irenaeus next to him, actually earlier, as you say, but Irenaeus saying, well, life on this earth is a school, and we learn from the sufferings through which we go, and we learn from the sufferings that other people go. This is all part of the education of humanity. Okay, that we have those two. And then the third one is Barry Casey's. So what is your distinctive contribution, as you see it, to this discussion? So you did not choose Augustine, you didn't choose Irenaeus, but you put forth your own understanding of these matters, which is rather daring in a dissertation, I might say. People usually analyze the work of others rather than presenting their own ideas. It's safer to do that, but you went out and you presented your own ideas on these matters. So how would you compare your position to those?
Well, I go back to the idea of hope, the experience of hope, I should say. And that was for me something that was quite personal. When I was younger, I was always the one who could find a penny in a mountain of horse dumplings, you know. And my friends referred to me as the optimistic one.
I remember that.
And, you know, I came to distinguish later on hope from optimism, but at the time, you know, that's what I went through. And so I started from that idea of hope, and I did a lot of study about hope itself, psychological, sociological, anthropological, just a lot of ideas that seem to me to say that hope is inherent in human nature. I was also influenced a lot by Camus, not so much by Sartre, but Camus, you know, and he's acquainted with despair, but he's also someone who is going to resist and push back against evil. And there's this one line. He was living in I think it was Prague, and it was winter, and he was sick, and he didn't have any friends, and it was just terrible. And he couldn't wait to get out of there. And he finally did. Toward the spring, I think he went down to Italy. And as he left, you know, and he's finishing up this little essay, he says, "I found in myself an eternal spring." As in the season, you know. And so Camus has always been for me someone that I think of as a kind of secular saint. I'm fully aware of his failings, but he sort of pointed the way. And so this idea that, you know, you can have hope without God was really astonishing to me. And, you know, I wondered, okay, what does he base that on? So here's the doctor in the plague who goes to work every day, puts his life on the line every single day. But he's an atheist. And I wondered, as I read that book, I read it over and over again, what keeps him going? And so someone in the book actually asks him that. And he says, because it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And then on the other side, you've got the priest who is calling down fire from heaven. He's condemning the people in his congregation for sinning and saying this is God's punishment. The plague is God's punishment. And finally, Dr. Ryu corners the priest and says, I want you to come with me. He takes him to the bedside of a child who's dying of the plague, and the priest breaks down. And the next Sunday, he stands up in the church, in the cathedral, and preaches forgiveness and grace because he's seen the meaningless death of this child. So what keeps the doctor going? It's duty. It's duty. And I thought, that's so courageous, especially for someone for whom God is not there. He just keeps going. And for me, who believes that God is there, I can take a lesson in the power of hope. And so that's kind of where I started, hope as a human element, and went from there. So this is how I put it. Let me just read to you what my thesis was. Excuse me, I'm just trying to find it here. When you asked me about to do this, Dave, I thought, wow, I haven't read that dissertation for probably 20 years. It's not like I get up every day and read my dissertation. So here's the thesis. Hope is primarily a staking of one's life on the premises that ultimately good will triumph over evil, that humans are called to act on such beliefs, and that hope so utilized will become a formative influence on ethical moral action. In other words, hope is an element inherent in human nature, which may galvanize moral resistance to the powers of evil and may form the foundation for an experientially oriented theodicy. So that's where I started.
Okay. Now, I'd really like to explore this notion of hope and ask the question, can hope be unethical? Is there any possibility that it would be wrong to be hopeful in some setting or set of circumstances? But I'd like to bracket that for now and then keep a little closer to your overall point of view. And maybe I can set it up this way by telling you how I used to teach a course, and I don't think you would.
Okay.
For many years, there was a course at Loma called, and still is, a course called God and Human Suffering.
Oh.
The elder Paul Huback developed that course, I think 3 generations ago. And so people have been teaching all the way through. And it's, I think it's the most important class that the medical students take. I teach ethics, but I think this is more important because it has to do with whether it's possible to believe in God in the face of all the heartache they're going to see, all the sorrow they're going to see. But I always began the quarter by reading the 2 passages I've just read. And I'd say, okay, when Jesus was with those who were weeping, he wept. But when he was holding his seminar off to the side with his disciples, he didn't weep. Instead, he just kept pummeling them with hard questions about moral evil and about natural evil, right? Just, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And then I would say, this is not a class about experience. This is a class about academic study of evil. Now, I think the point of your dissertation, if I understand it correctly, is that I started the course in an unfortunate way. And do I understand you correctly?
I would not want to say that, Dave.
Go ahead and say it, because I think it's true.
Well, from an academic standpoint of studying the history of it, you started the right way. I think that the experiential, you could still get to the experiential even by starting with the theoretical, and I hope you would have gotten there.
But that would be contrary to your method. You would have to start with the experiential. My guess, I don't know, would you start with an account, having people get in touch with their own experience of evil first, and then would you have them talk about the evils they have observed, or would you draw on wider literature or movies or poetry, somehow to get the course started on an experiential basis, because you really do want to start there and move to the theory, and you want the theory to be controlled by that, right? You don't want to say what I did for 46 years. Okay, that's what Jesus did at the tomb, fine. And when you're at the tomb, weep, but we're in a classroom. Okay. And I don't think you want to say that.
No. Well, it's interesting. I taught a course at Trinity. It was kind of an honors course for first year students, and it was called Evil, Suffering, and Hope. And these are young women, most of them from Washington, D.C. Trinity is in D.C. It's a women's college run by Catholic nuns. And for a lot of these students, they're the first ones in their family to go to college. And 10% of Trinity's population are those DACA dreamers,
Okay.
And in fact, Donald Graham, who offers scholarships for DACA students, is on the board of Trinity. So I taught this course that I developed, Evil, Suffering, and Hope. And we started with the Holocaust.
There you go.
Bam, right in there, But I mean, that wasn't the very first day, but we got there pretty quickly. And what I asked them to do was to write down, this is the second day of class, to write down an experience in which they felt that they had suffered to such an extent that they kind of woke up to it, to what it meant. It wasn't just, oh, I got a cut in my finger and that really hurts, but what have you suffered in your life that in some way changed your view of what life is about? And I got back stories of brothers being shot, mothers dying of cancer, father going to prison, they themselves being in detention, or having to have an abortion, or having a child that they didn't want. I mean, these are 19, 20-year-old kids, And so we kind of went from there. And it was a very emotionally rich semester for me. I taught the class 3 times. And at the end of every course, students would come up, sometimes with tears in their eyes, and say, I just feel like I learned so much about life. They're starting out their college career. And a lot of them are coping with hard situations at home. So we started out with the experiential. And the idea was that they're not alone. Everybody goes through these kinds of gut-wrenching experiences. And I drew this sort of graph on the board. It's something I picked up from William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. So it looks like this. You're going along and then you take a fall and it goes very deep. And at the pit, at the very bottom, you wonder if you can come back up. But you do, you come back up, and this time you come up higher than the point at which you fell. And so I think you start out innocent and you drop, and then you have experience, and now you come back up. And on the other side, you are no longer innocent. You are innocent experienced. 2 things together. You look at it differently, but your eyes are unveiled. You're seeing life differently, but you're not discouraged and you're not despairing. So that's kind of the extension of what we did there.
So that's exactly that would be, I would have started, say, with the Buddhist theories of suffering.
Yeah.
And then go from there. but I think the way you begin is powerful, and it touches not only distant suffering like the Holocaust, but their own. It gets them into. Did you find them reluctant to be candid about these matters?
They were writing only to me, and then if they wanted to share it in their small groups, they could, but they were not required to. But they were not reluctant about coming forth privately to me on these things.
Now, I'm getting back to your chapter. You have criticisms. You talk about the theoretical approach and the experiential approach, and we've heard how you use the experiential approach. But you have some criticisms of the theoretical approach. Yeah. What would you like to say about that?
When I talked about the theoretical, I said one seeks to construct a consistent, logical theodicy that can justify a good and omnipotent God who also allows evil. And here's the criticism. Such an inquiry stands outside the situation of suffering and thus is necessarily theoretical and abstract. It remains neutral on questions of justice and looks for universally applicable conclusions. I thought that Augustinian and Irenaean solutions, in quotes, provide the bases for such interpretations. And so I call that the theoretical approach. And, you know, I also know that it's important to think about these things in a place that is free of biases and so forth. So there's a place for thinking about this theoretically. So I'm not dismissing the theoretical. I'm just saying it's not enough. You know, we should link it with the experiential. And my criticism is that it's easy for me to sit in an office somewhere and come up with these problems that then have solutions and then pass those out into the world and say, here you go, you know. Now, I don't know if people actually do that. That seems a bit harsh, but that's how people perceive the discussion. That's how lay people perceive these discussions, is that they're not really in touch with the way people live and what they suffer from. So I'm coming from a more liberation theology kind of approach in that regard, to say, you know, get down on the ground, see how it works, do your theorizing, but always keep it in touch with the praxis.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk about the necessity for one to be realistic about evil and one to be honest about evil. Could you say something about both of those, realism and honesty about evil?
Yeah, I had four things about the experiential approach, and you've named two of them. Realism. The experiential viewpoint is characterized in the first place by a sober and honest realism about evil and its power. Those who know this view know only too well, sometimes firsthand, the destructive and debilitating power of evil as evidenced in racism, genocide, civil war, or human rights violations. For them, evil is the very real presence of perverted good. Injustice, trampling justice, order become tyranny. So it's seeing that evil is very real. Now, I suppose Augustine felt that his view made evil real too, but it doesn't really come across that way as the absence of good, not quite enough. And then honesty about evil. We must acknowledge the evil we are a part of and resist and transform it where it is found. For some, this means examining the elements in our interpersonal relations which alienate us from each other. For others, this honesty is instrumental in identifying the unjust structures in society which support and perpetuate evil. So it's a matter of facing up to injustice and evil. It's personal, it's systemic. The other two, should I go ahead and talk
Sure,
about?
please. Yes, please.
Okay. So realism about evil, honesty about evil. The third thing is experiential orientation toward concrete practical actions and away from mere theoretical interest in the question of evil and suffering. For those who hold that attitude, the question of evil is a call to action. And then the last thing is the element of hope. It's characterized by the element of hope, not only in the eschatological vision of the fulfillment of God's kingdom, but also in the meaning of evil, suffering, and conflict. Evil and conflict can be regarded as inevitable and as potentially meaningful in solidarity with other sufferers, and as eschatologically redemptive by helping sufferers identify with the crucified God. Hope functions not as facile optimism, but as realistic faith in action, recognizing that while evil and suffering are not theoretically necessary, they are inevitable and very real. So those four things, that's the experiential approach.
Yeah, I think evil being inevitable, not necessary, but inevitable. Reinhold Niebuhr says something like that, I think, somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, which always puzzles me. If it's inevitable, why isn't it necessary? That has always been a puzzle to me. We're just about out of time, so I'd like to ask this broad question, and that is this. If someone asked someone, what did Barry Casey talk about this morning? What would you like them to say? You finish the sentence. Barry Casey said what?
Hope is part of human nature and can help in fighting back against evil.
Okay, hope is part of human nature and can help in fighting back evil. That's good. Yeah, very good. So you may, you quote Marx someplace saying that the point is not to understand the world, but to change it.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Anything else before we take a break?
No, I think that's it.
Okay, let's take a break, and I'll ask you, like I ask all the other speakers, to disappear, because otherwise our colleagues will have a big conversation with you during the break that we will all miss. And so I'm going to disappear. I hope you do, and then we'll come back in about 10 minutes. Forrest, what do you think?
Yeah, let's make it 11:40 here on the West Coast.
Okay, 11:40 on the West Coast, and that I see Monty Butler has a hand up and Simona has a hand up. So after the break,
Anastasia has a hand. I see that.
Thank you.
Okay, we call her Sister Resurrection.
Yeah.
That's the meaning of her name.
Yes.
So Sister Resurrection. Very good. Let's take a break.
Okay. And so just raise your hands, and I see 3 hands up, 4 hands. And so let's take that break, and we'll come back at 11:40.
Okay.
And I'm going to pause it. Simona, can I pause it? Thank you. Okay, David, did you want to respond first to Monty's?
Yes, Monty has brought to our attention that the link that I've sent out for Barry's dissertation is not working everywhere. It works on my email. I've tried it again and again, and it works. But then it doesn't work on Bronwyn's, and she gets the same error message that some of you have been getting, I think, from Gmail. I haven't heard it from any place else. But I have put the link on the website at bransonlegacysabbathschool.com, and it's there. And I put it out in the, put the link out in the announcement that went out with the sign-in information again today. So it's those two places still. Now, Monty suggesting that I download it. I have downloaded it, and then to send it as a file. The difficulty is that MailChimp doesn't handle attachments very well or at all. So I'm having difficulty working this out with MailChimp. So what I would ask people to do is, if you want to get the dissertation and you haven't been able to, I can send it to you as an attachment in Gmail. I probably can't send it to you as an attachment in MailChimp, but send me your name, or just send me, I want the dissertation, then by Gmail, I can get it back to you as a file, PDF file, just like Monty said. Is that okay, Monty? We lost him.
I think we've lost it, but I'm sure it's okay.
Okay.
Okay, all right. And so to talk about resurrection, we're resurrecting your thesis, Barry.
All right, that's good.
Okay, I want to go to Simona to start our questioning. Simona, to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this discussion. It was very interesting. I find that our life philosophies are grounded in our experiences. And so when I think about what Irenaeus and Augustine have done, I think about their lives.
Mhm.
You know, Augustine is a man who left his wife, common law wife and son, and separated himself so he can get a view from a distance of what life is and what, you know, is the meaning of it, right? So when he speaks of God, in a way, he's speaking of himself.
Mhm.
And Irenaeus was a man who lived during the persecutions by Marcus Aurelius. And so he has seen suffering firsthand.
Yeah.
He probably lost friends, people he knew, people from his congregation. And so he had to find some kind of explanation, you know, how to get through this,
Mhm.
right? And so sometimes, you know, I find it kind of important to understand where people are coming from when they're, you know, talking about their philosophy, right? When you were talking about hope, I was thinking about Viktor Frankl and his logotherapy,
Mm.
and you know, I attended one of the last lectures that he had and actually spoke with him afterwards.
Cool.
And he was a man who himself was in a concentration camp. And what he observed, that people who had some kind of hope, people who had hope that there is someone out there waiting for them, they survived better, regardless of the fact that they were under the same evil. You know, they lived under the same deprivation of food, the same torture, same experiences, right? But people who had some kind of hope that there is something or someone waiting for them, those are the people who survived better. And so I agree. I mean, hope is absolutely essential. But, you know, I always go back to the 1 Corinthians 13. It says, you know, there is faith, hope, and love, right? And everybody usually thinks about these things as, you know, individual items. You know, you have faith as one thing, and you have hope as another thing, and then you have love as another thing. But I see that there's gradation.
Yes, that's right.
And that, you know, faith is when you believe in something that you cannot see. But then you have gradation, and there is, you know, there is the next step is hope, right? It has to have some element of faith in it. But then even if you lose faith and you lose hope, you still have love as the all-encompassing thing that is helping people survive. And so I find that to be probably one of the most important things that we as human beings can have, is to understand that, you know, even if you lose faith, even if you lose hope, there is still love. And I always go back to this essential, all-encompassing love of God that is so present that you simply cannot turn away from it.
Yeah. Yes. That's so beautiful. And as you spoke of gradation, it's almost steps on the journey. I like your idea that they're not separate elements, but they are linked like beads on a chain. And I think it does start with faith, and faith is the foundation of hope, and hope opens us then to love.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Simona. I will now go to Monty. Monty? If you want, there you
Okay.
go. Okay. To you.
Barry, thank you very much for your presentation. I am sorry that I haven't been able to read your dissertation yet, but I will.
Okay.
And I'm looking forward to that. It may be because well, first of all, from your presentation, your 4 points, it sounds to me, at first it was sounding to me like you were not addressing theodicy, but instead addressing how can we respond to evil in the world, not why is there evil in the world if God is all powerful and all loving. I think maybe after hearing you more, what you're maybe saying is that to deal with the first 2 parts, I think would be a way. You had 4 parts. To deal with the first 2 parts without dealing with the second 2 parts is inadequate. It's short-sighted, and our response is important in the big picture of defending God, in answering the question of theodicy. Does that kind of because what I'm kind of curious, and we'll probably get to this in a future question, is what is your answer to the theodicy question itself, the theoretical piece? I think is, and I'm not a theologian, so I don't think Augustinian or this other thing, and maybe Reinhold Niebuhr has kind of impacted me. I know he has impacted me with his idea of inordinate self-regard.
Yes.
But I think what I'm hearing you say is that evil is real, and evil is comes about, so the defense of God, because God does allow us free will. And given free will, human beings and the institutions that we create do evil. We don't have to do evil, but we have the free will to do evil, and God does not step in and intervene.
Precisely. You got it.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that the theodicy question is not important, but seeing as we're immersed in suffering, our question is first, what are we going to do about it? And by that, I don't mean that we can somehow solve evil, but we should be able to identify it both within ourselves and in human nature and in systemic and in institutions. We should be able to identify it honestly and then ask ourselves how we can deal with it. And behind all of that is the idea that in spite of evidence to the contrary, as we might feel down in the pit, God is love. So in a sense, when it comes to that theodicy question, I think I am implying That is not the first question to ask. The first question is to say, what are we going to do about it?
That,
Yeah, go ahead.
that's interesting. I'm going to end with my one question. I may jump on later on today. I will jump into the queue, but I'm also looking forward to the next few weeks. So I'll end there. Thank you for that answer. And I think I understand that that last piece is central to you. The horse and the cart. I think there's a little horse and a cart difference, maybe for the two of us, but I appreciate your perspective, and I'm going to try to think about that more.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. Goes to the heart of things.
Okay, all right. I will now go to Anastasia with her short question. Unmute yourself, Anastasia.
Okay,
There you
thank
go.
you very much, Forrest, and thank you so much for your presentation, and really appreciate it. I know it's a very short time, and the short time you had, you gave us some very good insights and information. If I may humbly say that, of course, because of the short time, there was some oversimplification, at least when it comes to Irenaeus. As we know, Irenaeus, and also oversimplification that it was just their environment. Environment does mean a lot, but also study, et cetera, which you did not say that. It was not from your part about that. The original sin, for instance, I think was not accurate, the statement that they were not made perfect. Yes, it was true, but also not true, in that only God is perfect. But from what we know is they were given free will. And Irenaeus, also many people confuse, or they think it's the same, the Eastern Orthodox with the Catholics, which is not. And I know anyway, there are many points where they agree, but many points that disagree, very, very definite. Like Irenaeus, for instance, does not believe in the original sin, and therefore the baptism by infants was not, although it's done now, and it's not done to forgive them from that sin, because exactly what you said, that they were because God, like Townsend said, had to choose between allowing evil or freedom, and he went towards the freedom with some choice, with choices. And so they were immature. They were not, I would say that rather, that they were not perfect, but in human ways they were perfect, but they were not like God.
Yeah.
So that differs there. I was very impressed with a lot of what you said, because I believe in that sense of the Platonian or Socratic about certain truths that are the big T's and then the little T's, and therefore they found they're found in, and you did a great work about that.
Yes.
They're a great place where this coincide. Myself being, again, like Saturn, when we say I am this thing that excludes others, but let's say I have the classical background and the classic professional thing with comparative literature. I saw a lot of what you said, of what I say Socrates rather than Plato, of what Socrates talked about good and evil. That we have to identify it, and he does not exclude the supernatural or past having to do, some call it fate, or some the consequences. But he did say that good produces good, evil produces evil. And we are very much, like in Matthew says, on the becoming.
Yes.
On the becoming, we are, right? And so what is given to us, we cannot do anything about, but we have to look for that F zine, what is best. And by best, we have all the agape, what is good, what is true, what this and this and that. But from what you said, very important, not only to live, because we live, suffering is evil, dying is evil, but to identify these things that are evil and those things that are good, in that big T things. And for that, not only we need the inspiration, but we need the knowledge. And in his tragedies, we see a lot of what you said, the experience. And the blind prophet says, to the old or to the suffering comes understanding, comes wisdom.
Yeah.
And I saw a lot of that in your saying. I don't want to take too much more time, but and the hope, and in his apology especially, Socrates believed he would rather live, he says, but when he wants to live, he wants to be free to do those things, and always comes not only with the I, what is good for me, but what is good for the others in the society. And I want to thank you so much, and about the hope, because he also believed in the hope of a just God, in the sense that of the embodiment of the good, the virtuous, the beautiful, etc. And you
Yes.
have a blessed Sabbath. Thank you so
Oh.
much.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful background. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
All right, I just had to replug my computer and somehow or another it hadn't got plugged in properly. So
Oh.
anyway, thank you, Anastasia. I would like to go to, see, I've got Peter. Peter, you're up.
Thank you very much, Barry, for your challenging presentation. We have a lot of why questions. Why evil in the world? Why so much suffering in the world? Why that happened to me?
Yeah.
And it was very daring to write a dissertation on this topic. I have a few comments and a few questions.
Mhm.
First, I was thinking that you're first trying to pick up the topic for your dissertation, and you said that you didn't know too much German, but you still ended up with Leibniz that coined the term of theodicity. Then you went back to the German philosophy.
Hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I believe that basically God created the universe with the potential for eventually for evil because it allows free will.
Yes.
That it's what I believe. And it's a problem of choice. That is very important. God created us in this way and let us to have a choice. David was reading some texts in the beginning of the presentation, and I was thinking of that Jesus, especially Jesus, wept at Lazarus' tomb. And that made me to believe that, well, God is very much involved in our suffering, in the suffering in general, because he suffered himself. Jesus suffered on the cross.
Mhm.
Then this is one point that we have to keep in mind, that it's very important for us. And also, I was thinking at how Apostle Paul is looking at the problem of suffering. And he makes a few interesting ideas, interesting points. First, he said that God made Jesus perfect through suffering.
Mhm.
Then perfection reached through the suffering. And Jesus was made perfect and above, God put him above everything in the heaven and the earth because he was made perfect through the suffering. Another point made by Paul is that God punishes those that he loves them, perfect them. And he said, like a child that is punishing his children because he wants them good or
Mhm.
good. Another interesting point, I believe, for us. Now I have a few questions. First, you were mentioning, to make your point, Albert Camus in our more modern times, but you didn't mention Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Mm.
I don't know if you mentioned it in your dissertation, but I think it's an interesting work and
Oh, yeah.
author to be mentioned in a dissertation like that. Because in Brother Karamazov, he was tackling this problem through Ivan. He's mentioning the existence of suffering in the world and all these things. And I believe it's an interesting work that it's tackling this point of view. And I mean, as a question, why you didn't mention, or maybe you mentioned it and you didn't, I mean, include it in your dissertation, but you didn't mention in your presentation now. And another question that I have is related to Jeremiah, I think 47. This is one of the texts that it's I mean, puzzling us, and it's hard to find an answer. God says that I created light and I created evil. But also, I mean, throughout the Bible, starting with Genesis, God, it's perfect, it's powerful, and the days of creation, after every day of creation, he said, I looked at what created, but it was very good. Then God recognizes himself that his creation was perfect, was very good, and still evil appeared in his creation. And also Jesus mentioned in Matthew 20:24, and he is talking about the suffering at the end of the world, a lot of suffering. Jesus said exactly this, you don't have to worry, to be very afraid, because this has to happen. My question is, if you can comment, how to explain this? Why has to happen? Why God is not preventing this and letting this to happen?
I think it goes back to the idea of freedom and us choosing what we will do, and we make bad choices. And once those choices are made, things are set in motion that sometimes get away from us. They become bigger than what we even thought. And so I think what Jesus is talking about is an inevitability of destruction that will take place. Not that it must take place in order, it is not necessary in order to complete some plan, but it is inevitable as this whole thing plays out, because the evil gets away from its creators. So I think when Jesus says this must happen, I think what he's saying is it will. I can guarantee it. Not that I'm making it happen, but this thing gets going and snowballs, and that's where it goes. If I go back to Karamazov, I would love to have included that, but I was not writing a dissertation on on evil as it shows up in literature. But, Yvonne says, I hand back the ticket. If it means that a child will die, I can't accept that. So he hands back the ticket. He doesn't agree. And in some ways, I sympathize with him very much. I feel that way too. And starting at that point, then I have to say, but if I hand back the ticket, that means that I am no longer engaged. I feel that that child should not have died, certainly not in that way. But now, what am I going to do? I want to exemplify and serve a loving God, and yet this child has been torn to bits in front of my eyes. If I hand back the ticket, I'm out of it. If I stay in it, which is more difficult and more gut-wrenching, I have to find a way forward. And I think that God will help me find a way forward. The other thing is, I don't need to defend God. God can defend God's self. What I do need to do is try to fight back against evil as I can. So in that sense, for me, theodicy is an important but not necessary element in how I live. I cannot spend my time trying to square that circle, you know. I have to spend what energy I've got trying to respond to my own fallibility and to the systemic evil that I see in the world.
Well, I was thinking when you mentioned Albert Camus, that I mean that Dostoevsky could be included also. I mean, he's a writer.
Oh yes, very much so. Yeah, and you had a middle question there that I think I didn't address.
Well, yeah, I was talking about Matthew 24, about Jeremiah 47, and
Oh yes,
yes,
yeah. God being the creator of light and dark.
right,
Yeah.
light and evil.
Yes. Well, I think that's probably true, as hard as it is to understand. But C.S. Lewis in Chronicles of Narnia says he is not a tame lion, you know. And I think he put that in there to get us away from the idea that that God can be whatever we want him to be. You know, that we shape God in our own image. And right now, what you hear in Christianity at a kind of popular level is that it's entirely about love, and there is no judgment and there's no accountability. It's just whatever you think God is, that he is, you know. And I can't really go along with that. I think God is sovereign, but God is also so much hidden from us in many ways. And there are things I simply don't know and probably will never know about God until I know him as he knows me. But that text always sets me back on my heels. And when I read Psalms, I see more illustrations of that darkness in God, because the psalmist never pulls any punches. He just says, God is furious with us. You know, he's going to kill us. Please don't kill us. And then we get to the New Testament and it's quite different in many places. So that element of God's light and dark is one that we've not really dealt with. But it's most definitely there.
Okay,
Do you
thank
think
you.
about making us perfect with suffering?
It's a risk on God's part, because suffering can often simply tear us apart. You know, this is what I don't like when people say, well, God sent that to you to test you or to try you in the fire. I don't feel like I've got the liberty or the power to say that on God's behalf. We learn from suffering, but it also can destroy us. And the learning part is not always assured. And sometimes what we learn is that we simply cannot trust anybody. So it's kind of a roll of the dice in some ways. God takes a risk on us.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Barry. Thank you. I'd like to go to Rod Corker. Rod, to you, sir.
Barry, I very much appreciated that your presentation is rooted in your own life experience, the authenticity of what you say, and even what you post on sites that I visit. I always read what you say, and I very much appreciate you speaking from the seat of your life experience.
Thank you.
I have three short stacked linked questions here. You began by citing your two underlying assumptions behind your thesis. God is multi-omni and supremely powerful. What if one or both of these aren't true? Have you revisited those assumptions in your life to see whether, in fact, they have held up in your experience? And further, on the back of that, have you explored the thought or researched the thought that perhaps God can't, at least in the near term, that maybe we're caught up in some cosmic struggle that we don't really understand? Now, I believe that evil is hardwired into humans. It's in our DNA. There's no getting around the fact that there was a flaw there. Adam and Eve had the propensity and the inclination to sin before the fall. It was in them. I find it more comforting and hopeful to believe that God can't rather than God won't. Finally, do you ever expect to live beyond hope, that is, moved to a platform of feeling assured? I find it quite difficult to worship a God that stops at hope. I understand and recognize the therapeutic power of hope, but I'm looking to go beyond hope to assurance. Hope by itself, not enough for me to worship it.
Yeah.
Comments?
Okay. See if I can address those. I think your first question was,
Your assumptions,
oh, right.
the validity of your assumptions,
Yeah.
the robustness of them.
You know, I was at Claremont, which was the Center for Process Theology, and process theology was not something at the time that I was involved in, partly because if everyone's doing something around me, I tend not to join it. You know, but John Cobb, wonderful man. I took a class from him and appreciated so much what I learned. Later on, like 20 years later, I came back to process theology, and a lot of it really rang true to me. The idea that, you know, you can't have all the legs of that stool. They're logically impossible to hold together. So which one would you give up, or which one would you modify? Well, as I understand it, process theology modifies the all-powerful or the all-knowing part of God, and in its place says, in a sense, God learns sort of in real time, and you know, we have a part to play in this vast drama that is working out here. But someone like David Griffin, who was also teaching at Claremont, would not want to, he does not believe that God has the power to stamp out evil or prevent it from happening. I'm still enough of a believer in the eschaton to say that at some point, God will put an end to this kind of existence that we know of and start something new. But
Agreed.
on the other side of that, if we have freedom, then could not this whole thing start up again? And I think it could. And yet what I would hope, hope against hope, is that all of us would have learned so that we would never want to go back there again.
I think there's a flaw in that process.
And yet, you know, the possibility that we start this whole thing up again is there. And again, that's God taking a risk on us. So yeah, I've considered that, and in fact, I was reading a book the other day called Encountering Evil. It was written by six people at Claremont when I was around there. One was an evangelical, then John Cobb, process theology, David Griffin, process theology, John Hick, Irenaean, John Roth, and Frederick Sontag, Jewish view, and Baptist view that is actually quite shocking from Frederick Sontag. And I was surprised as I read through those chapters again that I was nodding at every chapter, and then I would read the counter arguments and nod at those. And I thought, do I not have any kind of position here? You know? So I just had to kind of stand away almost in an Augustinian way and say, no, there are some things that I do believe about God and God's sovereignty, even though I cannot always prove them or even justify them. So in that sense, I'm sort of Kierkegaard, I take this leap and say, all right, I'm at the end of my logifying here. I'm going to throw myself on God's love. So I hope that.
That's a very good answer, Barry, and I appreciate it very much. The journey goes on, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah, the road goes ever on. Lord of the Rings.
Okay. I would like to ask a question because I've got some repeats up there. Thank you very much, Barry. I appreciated your discussion between Irenaeus and Augustine's views. And a pun intended, I'm more at peace with Irenaeus than I am Augustine.
Right.
So, and for those who don't know, peace means, is it, how in Greek, Irenaeus?
Irene, yes.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And the other one that I've appreciated you discussing again is Camus, Albert Camus.
Yeah.
I remember, I tried to read The Plague in French, but I got 2 chapters into it and I said, I'll never get this done. So, anyway, and by the way, the word plague, I always struggle with that. I always end up spelling it as plaque. So anyway, but yeah, I have several questions, but the one that I want to look at now, it's not so much a question, but you're talking about the priest who is saying, God is bringing this on you.
Yeah.
You've done something wrong. And I have dealt with that so many. I pastored for several years and people were always trying to think, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? Must have done something, of course, I didn't dare say it's something you did in a previous life, but it's anyway. And then the physicians said the reason he did that was because the right thing to do. And I think your point is what the physician said. We should do things because they're right. And I think too often we try to philosophize and say, well, this happens or whatever. And we don't know, but we do live in a world that 25,000 children die a day from bad water or disease. Yeah. And what can I do? So should I just be someone worried about today and not worried about the by and by, sweet by and by? Anyway,
Right.
Your thought.
Yeah, well, the doctor, every day he gets up and goes out there and he's literally, saving lives, trying to save lives, or at least make them easier in death. And he's risking his own life. And, you would ask him, why are you doing this? And another answer he gives is, because I don't want to live in a world where the death of children is somehow necessary,
Right.
or it's accepted. And so he pushes back. And, I just found that so admirable, especially coming from someone who had no place for God. And, Camus toward the end of the war, he went up to a monastery in the south of France, and you can read his address to them. He says, we're in a war, in a battle for truth here. And if you, meaning Christians, don't speak out, what can you expect of us? You know, and so he just really put it to them. And not in a harsh way, but in a loving way. He was saying, you know, I'm following Jesus more closely than a lot of Christians, especially those who are collaborating with Nazism, you know. And that's something you can infer from what he says. So, you know, I carried that all through college, thinking, what motivation do people have to serve in this way? Does it need God to do that? And according to him, it doesn't. But if we believe in God and we love God, is that not even more reason to do these kinds of things? Even more reason than Camus. Bless you, I think. So Camus stands in the background saying, are you being honest? You know.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll have more questions for you next week or sometime. But I'd like to go back now to our, I've got two repeats, and I'm going to go to Simona first, Monty, to keep the gender switch. No, that's not right. The gender alternate or whatever. So Simona, go ahead, ask your question.
Okay, thank you. You know, I have slightly different view. First of all, I don't take everything that's written in the Bible as a true expression of who God is.
Good.
We have to remember that these things were written by people, and they were writing based on their experiences, their philosophy, their understanding, which doesn't necessarily is true. And as Anastasia often says, you know, it's Jesus had to come to show what is true, because the image of God was so distorted in the minds of people that God had to intervene. So it was, you know, it was not just to save us, it was also to say, this is who I am.
Yeah.
Right. So when we talk about these texts, when we talk about, you know, God is the one who created good and evil. Well, you know, it's like saying, well, I gave birth to two kids, one is good, one is bad. Did I make them evil? It's not the same thing, right? And so we have to be very careful when we talk about the nature of God. And I think that nature of God is so expressly shown in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus that, you know, anything that goes against that cannot be true. And so we have to be really careful how we talk about it. Secondly, I believe that all things that are good in us are good in us because of God making us thus. And so you don't need to be a Christian to be a good person.
That's right.
But you need to be a good person to be a good Christian.
Yeah.
And so people who are not good persons, I don't care who they claim to be, but they cannot be Christians. You know, so there is a foundation that is absolutely necessary. And that foundation is that we show some of that image of God in our goodness, in our altruism, in doing what is right, in having conscience. You know, so all these elements are given to us as this, you know, being in the image of God, right? And then finally, the last thing, you know, God does not have to learn anything, because God is not limited by sequential time-space living like we are. He is outside of it. And so I think it's a very wrong way of looking at God and saying, well, you know, God is now learning in real time. When God is outside of time, he is the master of it. He is the creator of it, because there is space and time are one thing. And so if he created the space and he created the universe, he created the time as well. He is the master of it. He doesn't need to learn sequentially. But it is true that we also do not understand all the consequences that are larger than what we see ourselves. We live in this relatively small life, small world of our own that contains usually no more than a few hundred people, and this is our universe. This is what we know. This is what we experience. And so
Yes.
we learn from those things, and we see things through those small things, but we don't see the whole thing. We don't see what is happening in the large sense of this understanding of why all these things happen and how they're going to end, and how it is never going to happen again. And so these are not really even things that we need to worry about. We need to worry about right here, right now. Are we representing God? Are we the image of God to people around us? Are we those who are, seeking justice, who are taking care of the poor, who are taking care of the marginalized, who are representing God's love and showing God's character? So that is what we need to worry about. I'm not going to worry about things that I have no control over.
Yes, thank you. I agree with you. And that in the end is why I cannot fully go along with process thought. I do think that God is infinitely adaptable and can meet us no matter where we are, and can anticipate where we're going to land and try to reach us again from that point,
Yeah. If I could just add one more thing, you speak of hope, and sometimes I say that hope is the cruelest of feelings.
It was in Pandora's box, after all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it sometimes keeps you in a place because you keep hoping that things will get better.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
that's
Thank you,
why we need
Simona.
realism. Yeah, thank you very much.
I've got Monty, I'm going to give you the last question. We've got 2 minutes, and to you.
Thank you. Glad to be back talking with you, Barry. Enjoyed listening to your responses. So again, back to the four, your four key points. I'm not really surprised. I haven't read Camus, by the way, but I'm not surprised that as an atheist, he can have his perspective, because I think what he's answering is, how should I live? Which is only part of the formula, not
Yes.
who is God.
Right.
And I, as a born Adventist, am stuck with the trying to answer, either to be an atheist and ask, how should I live? Or if I want to hold on to my history, I have to answer the question, who is God? And I work to do that. And that's where the theodicy comes in. And I'd like to, and I'm inclined to throw myself, I forget if it was Rodney or you who said this, I'm inclined to throw myself on God's love. I can only do that if I believe God is love. And so then that brings me back to the whole theodicy question. I need to be able to answer that. And if I answer that, then I think that has to affect other things. So quick story, the way I answer that is, I believe that God doesn't intervene and interfere with us. He does allow me to have free will. And if I choose to do evil with my free will, that's going to hurt other people. To me, that helps define who God is and how I'm behaving. The combination between those two. In terms of then that impacts the rest of my theology. And so Rodney was talking about not only wanting hope, he wants assurance. Well, for me, I can't get from my answer of theodicy who God is to my theological teachings that I was given about heaven. Because as you were talking about, at some point, God will end this, and then we'll move to something else. Well, to me, I can't, the how you end and how you start anew goes against my understanding of why we have evil now. Is if God's going to do some miracle in the future to give us a new beginning, why didn't that happen before the Holocaust? Why didn't that happen? You know, at some point, the miracle happens.
Yeah.
And so that's one problem. But then there's, of course, the issue of it could all happen again. It's really not a solution unless, I mean, what we believe is God changes us and we become different. So that's the miracle. And then somehow we're supposed to then learn the lesson. So we've changed in a way where we can actually learn the lesson, or we're likely to make the same mistake.
Mm.
I mean, right now, day to day, if we say, well, we can just learn the lesson, do I need more evidence that evil causes pain and love can cause good? You know, how much more evidence do I need for this miracle to happen? And then if the miracle happens, but I'm not forced out of having free will, what am I going to have then that I don't already have now? If I'm just going to be another person with free will. So to me, that's why I like and I believe it. How I live is critical, but to me, if I'm going to hold on to a belief that God is part of that picture, I have to answer the first two pieces. I have to know what God is, and then that informs almost all the rest of my theology, because unless I know who God is central to all the rest of those two aspects to me.
Mm-hmm.
That's my struggle. I share it with you and look forward to exploring that over the next 2 weeks, and enjoyed it today. But I'm not sure what you would have to say maybe about that transition. That's one of the touchstone points that I struggle with in terms of theodicy is how does that impact my belief about heaven? Well, because you said salvation, you said, I think you said Sabbath and the second coming. And so the one piece I'm struggling with in my theodicy is I can't square my answer to theodicy with an idea of the second coming. I can't square them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's boy, thank you for those questions and comments. And I am definitely walking alongside you there. When it comes to the eschaton and what happens afterward, I just have to go on what I'm reading in the scripture, which I understand is their view of something that is almost inexpressible. So I'm not counting on streets of gold or even a pearl for the gate or anything like that. I'm pretty much agnostic on what it looks like, but what I'm hopeful for is that I will know God as God knows me, 1 Corinthians. We shall know as we are known. That's what I hang on to. And if I know God as God knows me in that depth as it would be possible for a human being, I hope that I would choose every moment not to betray that trust. And that's about all I can say on that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think.
It does, just one moment for us, please. Just to
Okay,
respond to
all right.
that,
You're the
please.
sheriff.
I've got time.
Yeah.
It does make me wonder, or cause me to reflect in that struggle. That is heaven. If heaven's going to happen, is it in the in-moment interaction between me and other people? God in and through me, not in the future, but now. And we often look to the future for a good experience, for love, but maybe it's what we bring to it every single day. I don't know, that's a long ways away, but but that could square with my understanding of God.
And the kingdom of God here and yet to come, right?
Well, with yet to come to me is because I can't square this big miracle happening. Yet to come is me tomorrow interacting with my fellow beings with the support of God to make heaven here on earth. I haven't been able to get to another world or a totally changed world given my answer to the theodicy question.
Right, right.
Okay.
I
All right.
understand.
Now, I hate to cut this off, but I need to. We'll surely continue this next week, Barry and Monty. And thank you so much, Barry. Where's David? David, are you there? I don't see, there you are, David. We are turning it back to you.
I am
And-
most certainly here, and I've been
There.
here the whole time. I
Okay.
haven't disappeared. Thank you, everybody, for very thoughtful and penetrating questions and comments. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you, Barry, for being Barry again. Quiet, thoughtful, positive. Barry's been this way since I've known him when he was about 10 years old. It's just been a wonderful. He's a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, but look at him smiling now. That's how he's done it all his life, all of his life. It's just amazing to me. Now, what we have here in the first part of this dissertation is kind of a review of literature. And as you folk do your scientific work, you often begin by reviewing the literature. And this is what we've had so far. Then next time, Barry will take us on a closer look at two particular people who have thought a lot about this. Then in the third time, we will get Barry's own view. That is, I think people are saying, well, what do you believe, Barry? And he's been quite disclosive, but it's in the third portion of his dissertation that he spells out in considerable detail what he has in mind. And that's where I think he is most daring. And I commend him for getting that past his committee, because it's a very, very interesting work. So hang on, stay tuned. This is going to be a good discussion. Now on the dissertation, please get it. I'm frustrated that I'm not getting it to you somehow, but I'll keep working on it. If you want it and you haven't received it, email me and I can send it back to you as a file right now. But I will continue to look for other ways of doing that, because it's very, very important. And the topic's important, and the way Barry goes about it is very, very important too. So here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. And I am now stopping the recording.